Hello, this is Mike Corrali, and this is the International Political Economy course. We're starting today with Chapter 6 in our textbook, Introduction to International Political Economy by David Malam and Bradford Dillman. As we're wont to do, we're taking each of these chapters, reading them, coming to understand the key terms, review the discussion questions, perhaps cast an eye at our suggested readings, and then take what we learn and apply it to a case study. In past, our case studies have included France and Germany, Japan, the United States, and Great Britain. Today, our case study is going to be China. We're looking at the global production structure and using China as a case study in understanding the elements of that structure. An important aspect of choosing China as our case study is its Belt and Road Initiative and how that conflates with what is suggested in our textbook about the global supply chain and the need for a production-based economy to be assured of its raw materials for industrial activities. Then, looking at the global production structure with China as a case study, we move into examining China both culturally, historically, economically, and politically in order to get our arms around what China means for a political economic study. China's move from being a poor developing country to a major economic power in about 4 decades has really been spectacular. From 1979, when the economic reforms began, to 2017, our last reasonably accurate reading, China's real gross domestic product, its GDP, grew at an average rate annually of nearly 10%. According to the World Bank, China has experienced the fastest sustained expansion by a major economy in history and has lifted more than 800 million people out of poverty. China's rapid growth has led to a substantial increase in bilateral commercial ties with the United States. According to U.S. trade data, total trade between the two countries grew from $5 billion in 1980 to $660 billion in 2018. China is currently the United States' largest merchandise trading partner, its third largest export market, and its largest source of imports. Many U.S. companies have extensive offshore operations in China in order to sell their products in the booming Chinese market and to take advantage of lower-cost labor for export-oriented manufacturing. These operations have helped some U.S. firms to remain internationally competitive and have supplied U.S. consumers with a variety of low-cost goods. China's large-scale purchases of U.S. Treasury securities, which totaled $1.1 trillion as of April 2019, have enabled the federal government to fund its budget deficits, which help keep U.S. interest rates relatively low. However, the emergence of China as a major economic power has raised concern among many U.S. policymakers. Some claim that China uses unfair trade practices, such as an undervalued currency and subsidies given to domestic producers, to flood U.S. markets with low-cost goods, and that such practices threaten American jobs, wages, and living standards. Others contend that China's growing use of industrial policies to promote and protect certain domestic Chinese industries or firms favored by the government, and its failure to take effective action against widespread infringement and theft of U.S. intellectual property rights, or IPR, in China, threaten to undermine the competitiveness of the U.S. in IP-intensive industries. In addition, while China has become a large and growing market for U.S. exports, critics contend that numerous trade and investment barriers limit operations for U.S. firms to sell in China, or force them to set up production facilities in China as the price of doing business there. China's growing economic power has led it to become increasingly involved in global economic policies and projects, especially infrastructure development. As I suggested, China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, represents a grand strategy by China to finance infrastructure throughout Asia, Europe, Africa, and beyond. If successful, China's economic initiatives could significantly expand export and investment markets for China and increase its soft power globally. Looking at the roadmap to political development in China, we find 4 key influences: geographical influences, historical influences before 1949, historical influences of the PRC, or the People's Republic of China, and the political culture. And so we begin with the geography of China. It has the largest population by far of any country on earth, and its land surface is the 3rd largest after Russia and Canada. Zonggao, meaning the Middle Kingdom, is the term that China gives for itself in the cosmic sense. Some of its important geographical features include access to oceans and many ice-free ports, many large navigable rivers, major geographical and climate splits between north and south, geographic isolation of the western part of the country, mountain ranges, deserts, and oceans that separate China from other countries, and these geographic features have helped shape Chinese political development for centuries. In the historical influences before 1949, our second of the main influences driving its economy, culture, and politics, we also break down into 4 significant areas: dynastic rule, control by other imperialistic nations, its revolutionary upheavals, and the civilization state versus the nation-state concept. Looking then at dynastic rule, the political culture inherited from centuries of dynastic rule centers around, first and foremost, and still true to this day, Confucian values, such as order, harmony, and a very strong sense of hierarchy, with superior and subservient positions. China has traditionally valued scholarship as a way to establish superiority. China has long valued scholarship as a way to establish an individual's superiority. There is a strong sense of cultural identity and a relatively high degree of cultural homogeneity. There is certainly an ethnocentrism as part of dynastic rule variable, whereby 90% of the population consider themselves Han, or members of a specific ethnic group, the Han Chinese. Some major influences for the dynastic area include the principles of the mandate of heaven and a strong merit-based bureaucracy. The mandate of heaven, or literally heaven's will, is a Chinese political and religious teaching that was used in ancient and imperial China to justify the role of the king or emperor of China, giving him, or the empress, her, absolute, unquestioned authority. This is similar to the Western tradition of the divine right of kings. It also includes a strong merit-based bureaucracy under the rule of the emperor, combining and coalescing power under the throne. But China has also experienced control by outside imperialistic nations. Imperialistic nations divided the regions of China into what are known as spheres of influence. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, China saw Britain, France, Germany, and Russia, later to be replaced by Japan, having de facto control over large swaths of territory. Resentment of the, quote, foreign devils, unquote, that they eventually rebelled against. In revolutionary upheavals, we note that there have been major revolutions occurring in China, first in 1911 and again in 1949, with many chaotic times in between. Three themes seem to dominate this revolutionary era: nationalism, establishing a new political community, and the need for socio-economic development. One important event of Chinese history that still influences political economic policies today is the Long March. From 1934 to 1936, the pursuit of Mao's army, the Communist Party in China, following Mao, by Chiang Kai-shek and his democratic supporters. The hope of pursuing Mao's Communist army into oblivion actually had the opposite effect. During the Long March, Mao and the Communist Party emerged as a hero of the people, and many of his loyal friends who were with him on the march lived to become prominent leaders of the People's Republic of China after its eventual founding in 1949. As I said, other imperialistic countries have often held de facto sway in China. For example, the Japanese occupied China during World War II, but after the war ended, the forces of Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong met in civil war, and as I suggest, Mao prevailed. In 1949, Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan, and Mao established the People's Republic of China directly under communist rule. And so looking at the People's Republic of China from 1949 to present, the People's Republic was born from that civil war between the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the communists under Mao Zedong. Mao named his new China the People's Republic of China, and Chiang Kai-shek claimed that his headquarters in Taiwan, the Republic of China, formed the true government. And so in effect we have the two Chinas. Maoism held from 1949 to his death in 1976. So looking at Maoism in 1949, its establishment and the precedent that it set, Mao was strongly influenced by Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, but his vision of communism is distinctly suited for China. He believed in the strength of the peasant and centered his philosophy around these central values: collectivism, struggle and activism, the mass line, or to learn from the peasants, to learn from the ground up, a sense of egalitarianism, and surely the need for self-reliance. So, in the political development of the PRC, we look first to its echoing of the Soviet model, or the era from 1953 to 1957, when Soviet Russia provided advice, logistics, and material support to China. Now, as part of the Cold War, as we'll develop further, the Soviets and the Chinese fell out and actually resulted in border skirmishes between the two and a cessation of diplomatic relations. But from 1953 to 1957, the Soviet model included land reform, civil reform, and what are known as 5-year plans. 5-year plans are a projection of 5 years to achieve a goal nationally, such as to nationalize the means of production or industry, to create agricultural collectivization, and socialism practiced through danwei, or work units, that controlled matters even so far as marriage, having children, not having children, and travel. After the break with the Soviet Union, Mao introduced the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward was a utopian effort to transform China into a radical egalitarian society. Its emphasis was mainly economic and is based on 4 principles: all-around development industry and agriculture, mass mobilization, everybody getting on board, everybody working toward an end, and this included backyard furnaces for making bricks and for smelting versus agriculture, political unanimity and zeal, and decentralization. Now, as I'm going to suggest, the Great Leap Forward was a great big flop. China's economy actually shrunk, and millions died due to famine. So what happened was many of the farmers, because of the collectivization of agriculture, sought instead work in the cities, and the migration to the cities was unprecedented, leaving the fields significantly unpeopled, unmanned. And so, with the fields being unmanned and agricultural collectivization being a flop, it resulted in a large famine, resulting in the death of say, between 18 and 45 million people to starvation. Then Mao introduced the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution was actually a direct response to the failure of the Great Leap Forward. Mao, being embarrassed by the failure of the Great Leap Forward, blamed its failure on Soviet interference and unloyal persons within the communist regime in China. And so while Mao is declaring the Cultural Revolution, it's more Stalinistic in form and in result, whereby Mao's main detractors then were silenced. The Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1978 suggested political, social, and economic change. Again, Mao's main goal was to purify the party and the country through radical transformation. He intended to remove all vestiges of the old China and its hierarchical bureaucracy and its emphasis on inequality that I had introduced in the first couple of slides. With Mao's death, Deng Xiaoping then would be the next Chinese premier. In 1978, the Chinese government decided to break with its Soviet-style economic policies by gradually reforming the economy according to free market principles and opening up trade and investment with the West in the hope that this would significantly increase economic growth and raise living standards. Deng Xiaoping's modernizations in 1978 are known as the Beijing Spring, with an open-door trade policy, seeking reforms in education, and the demise of collectivization in agriculture that saw such a failure, and the institutionalization of the revolution. And so Deng Xiaoping is called the architect of modern China. He is the second generation of party leadership. And following Zhou Enlai's death in 1976, he became friendly to the U.S. through its former Secretary of State, George Marshall. Deng Xiaoping's theory is it doesn't matter whether a cat is white or black as long as it catches mice. In other words, calling China a purely socialist government or a communist government or a state-controlled capitalist government, it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. The result of his leadership was a dramatic turnaround of the Chinese economy through a combination of socialist planning and the capitalist free market. He remained true to the Communist Party in theory, but practiced capitalism in reality. And so the economic reforms of Deng Xiaoping include rural reform, or the increase of agricultural production and rural income in China, what's known as the open door policy, or a turnaround from the inward-looking self-reliant economy to one that participates in the world economy through foreign trade, foreign direct investment, and creation of special economic zones. As we're going to see, China is going to join the World Trade Organization in 2000. It also includes industrial reform, which includes enterprise reform and price reform, as well as financial reform. The companies responsible for financial performance and borrowing money from banks to raise capital at the stock market, state-owned enterprises, SOE reforms, and ownership restructuring. And so how it works, these control mechanisms of the party. Interest groups and social movements are not permitted to influence the political process unless they are under the party state authority. Mass organizations formed around occupations or social categories that are allowed include the All China Federation of Trade Union and the All China Women's Federation. Protest is still disallowed, as we're finding as China exerts more and more control over Hong Kong. It is difficult for the party state to monitor citizens. The Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989 is proof of how serious China is in squelching protests. Major protests have been staged by religious groups, and there have been village protests, labor strikes, and stability issues. But for the most part, protest in China is tamped down by the party. And so when you're looking at how China's government works, one needs to understand that there are three parallel political institutions: the Communist Party of China, the CCP, the government, and the People's Liberation Army, or the PLA. And looking at the organization of the CCP, again, the Communist Party of China, it's organized hierarchically by levels, from the local to the center. The party actually has a separate constitution from the government's constitution of 1982, and its central bodies are the National People's Congress, or the NPC, that has the ultimate power of the state, that supervise and elect the Standing Committee, or the NPCSC, which is effectively the legislative branch, the President, who, along with the NPCSC, acts as head of state. And so this is a king in parliament function, as we discussed when we looked at Great Britain. There is a state council, which is the executive branch, whose premier sits at the head of government. You have the Central Military Commission, whose chairman is the commander-in-chief of the People's Liberation Army. You have the Supreme People's Court, the SPC, which constitutes the judicial branch, and you have the Supreme People's Procuratorate, or the SPP, which is effectively the Department of Justice. Looking at any kind of democratic participation in China, we remember that citizens are subjects of the government and are not participants in the political system. The communist state redefined political participation by creating a relationship between the Communist Party and citizenship, and by defining the economic relationship between citizens and the government. In recent years, popular social movements that support democracy, religious beliefs, and community ties over nationalism have influenced Chinese politics and helped to define China's relationship with other countries. So, looking at the backgrounds of the party members, we understand that there is transition in the backgrounds of the party members. Originally you had cadres, where you have peasants or factory workers come together as a collective, and very few were intellectuals or professionals. But with Chinese industrialization, the population and the economy is becoming increasingly technocratic. Today, less than 40% of party members come from the peasantry, although peasants still make up the largest single group within the CCP. The fastest growing membership category consists of officials, intellectuals, technicians, and other professionals. Women make up only about 20% of the membership and only about 4% of the Central Committee. The Chinese Communist Party does allow for the existence of 8 democratic parties. Their membership is strictly watched and strictly controlled, but they do serve an important advisory role to the party leaders. But there are no independent democratic parties. These non-communist parties are still under the control of the Communist Party. And so then the second step is looking at the government. Having looked at the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, we now look at the second leg, which is the government. As I suggest, the government is also made up of 3 branches: a legislature, an executive, and a judiciary that rise from the CCP through the People's National Congress. The National People's Congress choose the president and the vice president of China, but there is only one party-sponsored candidate for each position. And so the executive and the bureaucracy is made up of the president and the premier. Xi Jinping, who you're probably very familiar with, is the president, and Li Keqiang, premier. The consolidation of power is antithetical to pluralism, and so is, in effect, authoritarian by nature. We're looking then at an authoritarian government, and so we're going to want to look for signs of any mercantilism in economic policy that goes hand in hand with authoritarianism. And I might argue neocolonialism is an important aspect of mercantilism, and mercantilism is very supportive of an authoritarian regime. Xi Jinping is the General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, the CPC. He is the president of the People's Republic of China, the PRC, and the chairman of the Central Military Commission, the CMC. He has been paramount leader, the highest ranking officer in China since 2012, and officially received the title of Corps Leader in 2016. He also holds ex officio seat on the Politburo Standing Committee of CPC. And so, having looked at the history and the government of China, we now turn our examination to its economic aspects. And we look specifically at the rise of China in global production. China represents a large proportion of the world's economy. Its population, as of mid-2017, was 1.386 billion, or 18.4% of the 7.53 billion world total. As I've said before, its land is second only to Russia and Canada, with 3.7 million square miles, or 7.1% of the world total. Its GDP, its gross domestic product in 2017, in US dollars, was $12.24 trillion, or 15% of the 80.683 total world GDP. Its GDP annual growth, again as of 2017, is 6.9%, or 2.72 times that of the 2.86 world average. Its gross national income, GNI, purchasing power parity, PPP, per capita, was US $16,760. China is under transition and developing through a unique path, through its history and through its culture and its politics. It may provide lessons or experiences for other developing countries or other countries under transition. And so, trying to understand how China has increased so steadily and so rapidly in the last 40 years, we want to look for indicators of development in its production capacity. And so we want to look at its economic growth, its GDP. We want to look at its demographic growth, especially its per capita spending, which has increased 6.2% year over year. We want to look at its social aspects. We remember society was deeply distrustful and suspicious of itself. Coarseness in civil behavior had dissipated dramatically over the last 3 decades. China is becoming more westernized in its social aspects. In its infrastructure, we understand we're looking at the optimization of process yield and consistency. Geographically, as I suggested in the beginning, China has incredible attributes of air, water, and soil problems, habitat destruction, and a great loss of biodiversity by virtue of its industrial production. As we're going to go into looking at the Human Development Index next, it includes life expectancy, education, and gross domestic product. And so looking at this next graph titled Chinese GDP Current US Dollars, starting in 1971 and ending in 2016, we see the Chinese GDP down at the single-digit area. Our next slide looks at Chinese per capita spending starting in 2017, just under $1,500, going upwards now to 2018 in this graph with $4,063 US in December of 2019, but the last updated number that we have. So going from under 1,500 in 12 years, increasing almost fourfold. The HDI, which is the Human Development Index, looks at a couple of different variables of life expectancy increasing, education increasing, and GNI, or gross national income, also significantly increasing. The HDI index is in there as well. So having looked at this Chinese economic miracle of the last 40 years, its newfound preeminence on the world stage, both economically and militarily, we have to ask, what are the reasons for China's success? My supposition is, by studying China as a case study, it may be an instructive lesson for other developing countries. So, how did China succeed? Well, one of the keys, first, is the idea of the late developer advantage. So, when China hit the global stage, most of the industrial developments, such as technology, internet, communication, air travel, infrastructure, industrial development, had already evolved. They evolved in England and in the United States and in Western Europe and in other Asian countries. And so China is able to take advantage of the technological evolution that had already taken place and just step right out onto the world stage using that advantage. Similarly, it had a predominantly rural start. And so looking at the numbers of gross domestic product and human development index and gross national income are relative to the difference between a rural income and a highly technological urban income, or even an industrial production income. I began our examination by suggesting that China is inherently Confucian in its outlook and holds strict Confucian values to this day. And so Confucian values rests upon the belief that human beings are fundamentally good and teachable, improvable, perfectible through personal and communal endeavor, especially self-cultivation and self-creation. And so what you're looking for then in this Confucian worldview is humility, a high regard for education, a high regard for hard work, a respect for authority, a respect for hierarchy, and personal responsibility. And so I would argue that the Confucian values extant in China's culture help contribute to China's success. China's investment in education, the sense of gradualism, of making moderate, controlled, consistent steps forward, helped China's success. They were able to experiment with decentralization, and we'll talk about special economic zones in a moment. We remember that competition is within the state and the private sector, that the state is the private sector. The state is controlling the economy. And so it has the command, the authoritarian command of the economy to force it to grow in directions that it deems to have the most potential success. It has an export-oriented growth. Many of its products are intended for foreign markets. And it has very good accountability in its culture and in its government. And again, because it is authoritarian by nature, it relies on the rule of law, and a stable political environment is conducive to a successful economic environment. We remember that there are 4 main determinants of a country's productivity, and this is covered in our textbook at great length. First, the availability of land and natural resources. As I said, China, being the 3rd largest landmass country in the world, certainly has land, certainly has natural resources. Being the most populous nation in the world, it certainly has the labor. It has the vast labor pool of the Chinese citizen. It has capital, and it is developing entrepreneurship. There are challenges to China, such as population and environmental pressures. There is growing employment insecurity with displacement and, as Schumpeter called, creative destruction. There is growing inequality and poverty between the haves and the have-nots, especially between the urban and the rural. And at the macroeconomic level, there is instability stemming from incomplete reforms, or reforms that have not been taken far enough. China is also in the midst of 3 specific transitions, from a planned economy to one that is effectively market-based, from a rural agricultural society to one that is innately urban and industrialized, and from a non-WTO nation or World Trading Organization nation to a WTO nation. As I suggest, they joined in 2000. The spread of market forces in China must be encouraged. The government must begin serving markets by building legal, social, physical, and institutional infrastructure, and it must continue the integration with the world economy, and that must be deepening. and that includes its contributions and its participation in the WTO. To summarize very quickly then, economic prosperity varies substantially around the world. Some countries are at times richer than others. Economic growth rates are also very substantial. The relative position of a country can change over time. The standard of living within a country depends on the economy's productivity, and productivity depends on 4 determinants: physical capital, human capital, natural resources, and technological knowledge. The government policies can influence the economy's growth rate in many ways: by encouraging saving and investment, encouraging investment from abroad, fostering education, maintaining property rights and political stability, by allowing free trade, by controlling population growth, and by promoting the research and development of new technologies. Now, the accumulation of capital is subject to diminishing returns, especially with foreign direct investment, or FDI, that your book talks about. The more capital an economy has, the less additional output the economy gets from each additional unit of capital. In other words, when you begin to invest in the infrastructure or you invest in the economy, at first a little bit goes a long way. But as the economy becomes more and more industrialized, that same amount of capital, that same amount of investment actually reduces in out. Higher saving leads to higher growth for a period of time, but growth eventually slows down as the economy approaches a higher level of capital, productivity, and income. The return to capital is especially high in poor countries who are experiencing the catch-up effect. So this brings us to the Belt and Road Initiative and the global supply chain that's talked about in your book. And so we look at China over the last 2 decades having become a key economic player for many countries across Africa. They have invested billions of dollars in Africa through foreign direct investment. They have begun and completed massive infrastructure projects, extensive resource extraction, so mines and agricultural and natural resource extraction, deepening and evolving the debt relationship, that when China invests then in the infrastructure of an African nation, it's not doing it only to benefit itself. There is a bill attached. There is a cost to that. And the African nations then become indebted to China. What happens when one nation becomes severely indebted to another nation is they become, in effect, a neo-colonial economy. In other words, they exist to serve the cosmopolitan country or the lending country, the developer. There is an application of hard and soft power. Your book talks about this. Hard power is the use of military. Soft power is the use of economic forces and diplomatic forces to achieve a country's goal. And so if you have a deepening and evolving debt relationship between the cosmopolitan and the colonial powers, then the application of soft power means that the cosmopolitan nation can call the tune if it needs support from the debtor nation. And all this really is outsourcing. It is producing the goods that China needs in its manufacturing offshore by outsourcing to these African nations and creating components of what will eventually be a finished product that China will then export to the world. Africa is now the 3rd largest destination for Chinese FDI, behind Asia and Europe. It receives half of all Chinese FDI, government and private. Xi promised $60 billion in assistance, investment, and loans to Africa in 2018. There are an estimated 10,000 Chinese-owned companies in Africa, 90% of which are privately owned. Privately owned Chinese companies can be directed by Beijing to invest abroad because it has a command economy. And so we see the top 10 countries receiving Chinese investment in this graph as being Nigeria, Angola, Ethiopia, Kenya, Zambia, South Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, it's proper, Cameroon, Mozambique. Mao always had political connections in Africa. He wanted to support Africa in his struggle against the Soviet Union, looking to block Soviet influence on the UN Security Council, going back to the 1950s and the demarcation between the Soviet-Sino relationship. This grew to expand a desire for a source of raw materials and offshoring, outsourcing, and scaling, as described in your book. If we look at Chinese investment by industry in this next chart, we understand that agriculture, forestry, animal husbandry, and fishing at 2.5%, wholesale and resale at 2.7%, scientific research, technology services, geological prospecting at 4.1%, leasing and business services at 5%, real estate at 1%, miscellaneous others at 2%. But then we look at the big four, right? First and foremost, it's mining. And so Chinese investment by industry at 30.6%, the lion's share, is for mining. In other words, to extract raw materials from Africa. And so they're building infrastructure by virtue of the Belt and Road, creating railroads, creating roads, creating ports, creating airports that are intended to help extract, transport the raw materials that these Chinese companies are investing to extract. So the Belt and Road Initiative, coupled with Chinese FDI, they're two separate things, to an end, which is to extract and transport raw materials out of Africa to China. Building an industry, 16.4%. Manufacturing, offshoring manufacturing then by Chinese industry, 15.3%. But then finance, 19.5%. And so financing African infrastructure is in itself nearly 20% of the distribution of China's direct investment in Africa. What are they mining? We get that they're mining. We get that they're building infrastructure to extract. But we ask ourselves, what are they mining? Our next slide then shows 19% of the total percent of Chinese investment by sector is for oil and natural gas. 18% is for railroad. 10% is for other mining. 9.2% for hydroelectric dams. 7.4% for iron ore. 6.9% for copper. 5.9% civil construction, manufacturing, uranium, gold, water. If we look at the biggest constraints in Africa, first and foremost, you're looking at infrastructure. So there's a lack of roads, lack of ports, railways, bridges, airports. So manufacturing, we understand, rests on infrastructure. You can't manufacture if there is no infrastructure. So China coming in with the Belt and Road Initiative and its FDI in mining and in manufacturing and in construction then is creating a two-pronged situation in Africa whereby the African nations are going to be beholden to China not only for the loans they're taking out but the building of their infrastructure. Now, special economic zones that are set aside to support companies wishing to invest in African countries, including tax deference, waivers, and duty forgiveness. Looking at labor, mostly Chinese workers are benefiting from the Chinese state and private sector initiatives. Chinese workers are being transported then to Africa to live less expensively and to make wages, thereby displacing the African workers who might be benefiting from this investment. We're also looking at a displacement of influence, diplomatic influence, soft power between China and the West. China is investing in the economy in Africa. The West is investing in the curtailment of HIV and AIDS and in water projects. So China is investing in the economy. The West is investing in health issues. China's investments are large and impactful, ostensibly with no strings attached. Western investment as a stock is larger than China's, but China is catching up. Western aid comes with political and social strings, often conditions through the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund for supportive democratic institutions and human rights. And so whereas China's investments come with no strings, the West's aid comes with strings to support democratic institutions and human rights. Looking at China's big move, the next slide gives us the country's foreign direct investment growth in Africa from 2010 to 2014, and we can see the difference, where China is about 25% of FDI in Africa, South Africa in and amongst itself, the UK, the US, and France. And so the US then is under half of what China is investing. So again, looking at hard and soft power, the next slide gives us the perceptions of China in Africa, or a percentage positive about China's economic and political influence in Africa. Remarkably, in 3 of 5 African regions, China either matches or surpasses the United States in popularity as a development model. Public perceptions not only confirm China's important economic and political role in Africa, but they also generally portray its influence as beneficial. In the next slide, we're reminded of Lenin's criticism as we studied in our look at socialism and Marxism. The big criticism of the Western capitalist model is neocolonialism, or economic colonialism. And we see the irony in the Chinese Communist Party, ostensibly Leninist in its foundation, using its economic influence as a neocolonial power. The essence of imperialism is military bases, which is hard power. Unsurprisingly, China's first overseas military base is in the Horn of Africa, that, not unrelatedly, is experiencing a debt crisis due to overextended loans from China. Wrapping up then, our seminar question, as described in the Canvas module, asks if you agree with the assertion that the Chinese system of government, which is authoritarian in nature, seems to evidence a mercantilist, neo-imperialist approach to production as evidenced by the Belt and Road Initiative. Our seminar question asks if you agree with the assertion that the Chinese system of government, which is authoritarian in nature, seems to evidence a mercantilist, neo-materialistic approach to production as evidenced by the Belt and Road Initiative. And so, my friends, thank you for your patience. Once more, we are in Chapter 6, The Global Production Structure, in our textbook Introduction to International Political Economy by David Balam and Bradford Dillman. Looking at the key terms, I think we've covered several of these in our lecture today. We're looking at transnational corporations, or TNCs. We've talked about foreign direct investment, FDI. We've talked about outsourcing, offshoring, and scaling. We've looked at corporate social responsibility. We've looked at tax havens. We've looked at transfer pricing. We've looked at guaranteed basic income. And we've looked at sovereign wealth funds. All these elements, then, found in your book should find their way, one would hope, into your essay. Thank you for your patience. Have a great day.